apologize about this delay. My protector and I were stuck in the lift for the past 25 minutes or so. But we are here now. There is a job to be done. Let's get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hogan, just to recap and to summarize on what we touched on before the lunch adjournment, when you testified about Mr. Zuma saying that Mr. Gama is his choice, you recall. When you note the machine won't be able to take your answer. Yeah. Do you recall? Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Now, during that interaction, you said that Mr. Zuma was aware that Mr. Gama was the subject of an investigation pertaining to serious procurement irregularities.
Yes.
And you conveyed to the ex-president that the board had underwent a very professional selection process and that Mr. Gama was the choice of the board, but despite that, he still insisted that it must be Mr. Gama and no one else.
Yes.
I think, didn't you say Mr. Gama instead of Mr. Maseko?
Yes.
Maseko, yeah.
I beg yours, Mr. Chair. Now, what I want to know from you is that when the candidacy of Mr. Gama was considered, did the board only consider the question of the pending disciplinary, the pending investigation, or were there other issues which made the board to persist that Mr. Maseko was in fact the suitable candidate?
In fact, when the board received the report of its nomination subcommittee, it then discussed those matters and made its nomination and its recommendation of Mr. Maseko. Ms. Ramos then only introduced the update on the investigations of Mr. Gama after the board had made its decision. Now, Chair, the allegations of misconduct were initially centered on senior people, but not necessarily Mr. Gama at a certain point. Mr. Irwin had received a whistleblower's report and had referred it on.
And that was Mr. Irwin being the former minister.
The former minister, and had forwarded it on to ESCOM for investigation. That was related to the purchase of 50 locomotives. It was not immediately apparent that Mr. Gama, who was the CEO of Transnet Freight Rail that was doing the purchase, was implicated in any way. And let me say now, Mr. Gama was not ever found guilty of fraud. Okay. However, there were other senior managers who were found guilty of fraud and they were dismissed. Okay. So then another query had come up in the interim about a contract between General Nyanda Security Advisory Services and Transnet Freight Rail, a security contract that had been entered into that had certain anomalies, and that was also further investigated, and Mr. Gama's conduct in that matter also had to come under the spotlight. But the board at that stage, as I understand it, was not completely au fait of how Mr. Gama was centrally affected, a central player in this. And Ms. Ramos had the day before requested Transnet internal audit to provide an update. And that update is what we have from Transnet internal audit, which I think is C. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
We will be getting to it shortly, but
Which then starts to definitely identify Mr. Gama as one of the people who had to be investigated. So, yes, there was no sense at the time of the discussions that the reason why they were turning Mr. Gama down as a recommendation was more on capabilities. And let me stress here as well, Mr. Gama received very fine assessments, and he is considered, as is his fellow senior managers. They are considered, all of them, in terms of the assessments, got very good reports. But there were just certain aspects which, from the individual evaluations and whatever, made them not suitable to be the recommended appointment at this moment in time.
So if I understand your evidence correctly, you are saying to the chair that a number of factors were considered in relation to various issues, which were also considered by the board in relation to Mr. Gama.
That's correct.
Now, may I refer you to page 40? Just to round up this issue. You will see that on page 40, you have 4 unnumbered paragraphs. I need to direct your attention to the paragraph just before the heading Citizenship, Credit and Criminal. Can you see that heading? Can you see that paragraph?
On page 40?
Yes, 40. The fourth paragraph.
The fourth paragraph, yes,
Yeah,
okay.
the one that starts with, it says Mr. Maseko's preferred style
Yes, yes.
of problem solving is explorative and reflective when faced with unfamiliar or new business environment or industry. This indicates that in a new large organization like Transnet, he would benefit from an experienced mentor and coach who fully understand the complexity of the organization. Now, a question might be posed to say that if indeed Mr. Maseko was an excellent candidate, why would he still require a mentor when he is appointed at this large institution?
Mr. Maseko came not from within the ranks of Transnet, but from outside the ranks of Transnet. He had extensive experience in running a company that deals primarily with infrastructure and logistics and the movement of goods. And Transnet is a very complex organization, and anyone who came in as CEO from the outside would need a proper induction process. And my understanding of that is that he would undergo a comprehensive induction process, but that his managerial capabilities and his ability to assimilate and his managerial qualities overweighed any instance that he was, he was just someone who wouldn't know what to do when he arrived.
Yes. Now, in paragraph 35 of your witness statement, you refer to persons and organizations that were vocal that Mr. Gama was the candidate of their choice. Could you please provide the context and detail to the contents of this paragraph?
Yes. During the course of all of these matters, the media began to carry stories that Mr. Gama was being sidelined in favor of a white candidate, Mr. Wells. And the Transnet chair had already met with me and asked if I could assist with media statements to set the record straight. There were other media reports that saying he was the preferred candidate or the second preferred candidate, the next on the list after Pravin Gordan, and they were dealing with, it was often in Sunday newspapers. Later on, when Mr. Gama was suspended by Transnet, about a day before and in the following probably 10, 11, 12 days, several organizations issued very, very firm statements that Gama would become the CEO and that he was being sidelined. Should I continue with those, mentioning who they were?
Those media statements are the ones contained from page 95 to 113, am I correct? I intend to deal with them in due course. But
Sure.
I just want you to confirm whether are you referring to those media statements?
Okay, all right.
Are those the ones from page
Yes,
95?
it was those. It was in that
And they
order.
go up
and there
until
was
page
also-
113.
Yes, and then there was also 2 cabinet ministers, Minister Sipiwe Nyanda and Minister Jeff Radebe, also made very, very strong statements that Mr. Gama was being sidelined, that he would become the CEO, and that he was being persecuted like Mr. Zuma had been persecuted.
And those cabinet colleagues that you're referring to them are the ones that are, you are testifying about on a statement on paragraph 35. When you say that the problem was that President Zuma, 2 of my cabinet colleagues.
Correct.
So you are referring to Minister Jeff Radebe and.
Sipiwe Nyanda.
Yes. May I refer you to Annexure C on page 46? Now, annexed to that letter, it's a document on the next page that is styled Summary Report by Transnet Internal Audit into Allegations Relating to Transnet Freight Rail. Now, could you please...
Before you proceed, Mr. Mokoena, is it more convenient for you to deal with those media statements later rather than now, seeing that she has just mentioned?
Yes,
names?
Mr. Chair, there's a context to
There's a
them.
context.
In terms of chronology, yes.
Oh, okay, all right.
The 2 documents that I've referred to you on page 46 and 47, could you please tell to us what do they relate to?
Okay. After having received the whistleblower reports at different times, Transnet Internal Audit was asked to investigate these. The first tender, which raised problems, was the 50 like new locomotives. That was a decision made by Transnet management, which government really agreed with, that certain locomotives could be refurbished in the interim until we purchased new. And the Transnet board, in agreeing that this particular company should get that contract, said that the refurbishment must take place in Transnet itself. At that stage, it was called Transwerk or Transnet Rail Engineering. That is one of the divisions of Transnet. And Transnet wanted to up its ability to build, maintain, refurbish locomotives instead of constantly trying to outsource. Government's intention was also that government does not, and this was an initiative between public enterprises and trade and industry, that we look very much at creating such a manufacturing capability in South Africa rather than importing rail stock from abroad. Also, South Africa always had that kind of rail manufacturing capability. Union Carriageway down in Dunator was a private sector one, and Transnet had it. So the expenditure on refurbishing this was meant to advantage South Africa's manufacturing capability and to provide jobs. So Transnet Board passed a resolution to say that this contract, the work must be done in-house, only to find out later that Mr. Gama had signed off the contract with no reference to that it should be in-house, and only to find out later that the company, which had an international component, an American component, as I remember, was a local component, had started such a facility near to Pretoria and was already investing and building it up. And Transnet had to now roll that back, and they had to go to the United States. There was a lot of things. Transnet had to pay a penalty. All sorts of matters arose out of those kind of complications. So that, what we have here is that this was a matter that Transnet internal audit was investigating, and they say here that the contract that was signed did not take into account, and that's on page 48, and it's the third bullet from the bottom. The contract signed by Mr. Gama did not take into account the resolution passed by the Board of Directors.
Now, if I may refer to page 49, under the heading Conclusions.
Yes, on page?
49.
No, yes. So the conclusion at that stage, 49, in terms of Transnet internal audit, was that the signatories of the contract did not comply fully with the board or the director's resolution, and consequently disciplinary action must be taken against the relevant signatories to the agreement. The presiding officer of a disciplinary hearing should take into consideration the implications to Transnet of the non-compliance and the resultant additional costs to Transnet in determining the appropriate sanction.
Yes, and you're saying that Mr. Gama was the one that also signed the contract?
Yes. Now, Mr. Gama was not in control of the tender board. You know, Transnet had a whole series of boards from different divisions and whatever. But as the general manager of Transnet Freight Rail, it was his job to sign off on the contract. And he gave evidence that he hadn't, you know, he was under pressure and he quickly signed it. He hadn't really read it through because he was more or less aware of the contents. Yes, that was that one.
Now, you also make reference in your statement to one Mr. Wells.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mokoena. So this, the time of this letter and the report from the Transnet's internal audit section was happening in March 2009,
Yes,
before your time.
yes,
Thank you.
yes.
You also make reference to Mr. Wells in your statement, Ms. Hogan. How did he feature in this saga of Mr. Gama?
Mr. Wells was the acting CEO, and he was instructed by the board to initiate proceedings and whatever. I'm not exactly sure the details are here, but as I understand it, he then handed it over to the head of human resources to manage. And that was a process that then went ahead. Mr. Wells faced a tirade of insults. It was a fusillade of insults, racist comments, accusations that he was trying to thwart the progress of a very good black manager. As I've said before, partly because he wanted the job, that it was alleged that he wanted the job himself, which was not true. Those accusations never, ever stopped. Even into the disciplinary hearing, the person who conducted the arbitration hearings at that point listed the number of accusations that were laid against Mr. Well that proved not to be true. And they are they are not nice accusations. They are, our country has gone into a mode of destroying people in the public domain, and it was that kind of thing. And in that very disciplinary hearing, Mr. Gama was found guilty of the way that he criticized, the manner in which he criticized the Transnet executives, and Mr. Wells in particular, and he said he would apologize.
Yes. May I?
But I'm sorry, Mr. Mkwena. As at March 2009, when the Transnet Internal Audit Section made this report, Mr. Wells had actually withdrawn his candidature a few months before, in December, is that right?
Correct, in December 2008.
So when Mr. Gama was charged with allegations arising out of this investigation by the Transnet Internal Audit Section, he was no longer an interested party in terms of the position, Mr. Wells.
Yes, he was no longer an interested party.
May I refer you to page 53, Annexure D? Could you please identify that document for us?
This was the document which I gave and went through with to the President at the end of July 2009. As you would recall, Chair, I had undertaken to come back with more information to the President relating to the appointment of Mr. Maseko. As you will see in the document, I took quite extensive legal advice on this matter, and a lot of research was done. And this I gave to President Zuma, and I went through it.
Before that, Ms. Hogan, you also set out the purpose of this document on paragraph 1.1 to 1.5. And I think that those issues are quite important, which you conveyed to the President. Could you please read them into the record?
Yes, yes.
Could you please read them into the record?
If there was?
Could you please read the
Okay,
paragraph 1.1 to 1.5?
It was to brief the President on the following matters. 1.1, the legal framework governing the appointment of a group Chief Executive Officer for Transnet Limited. 2, the CEO and the recruitment and selection process undertaken by Transnet Board of Directors to employ a CEO. 3, investigations into allegations of corruption at Transnet impacting one of the candidates for the position of a CEO. 4, assessment of the recruitment and selection process by the board. 5, the recommended process forward and the risks involved in the appointment of the CEO. That was the content of that.
So already in 2009, long before this Commission of Inquiry, as per 1.3, there were already those issues pertaining to the allegations of corruption at Transnet, as we've indicated in that paragraph.
Yes.
Now, what I want to know, Ms. Hogan, you then had a meeting with the ex-president and also provided him with this detailed memorandum. Did you
Yes, I did.
Did you take the president through this document?
Did I?
Did you take the president through this document?
Yes.
And what was his reaction?
I'm sorry, before that, when was that meeting?
It was towards this document is dated the 28th of July, so it must have been within a week of that. You see, I was approaching the president because the process for appointing the CEO had been halted. We had to then postpone the AGM of Transnet. And I was wanting the president, this document comes with a recommendation that Sipho Maseko be appointed. And so it must have been between the date of his document, the 27th of July, and the 11th of August, when the Transnet when the Transnet AGM took place.
And this meeting that you are talking about now, between yourself and the president, where you took him through this document, this memorandum of 28 July 2009, that was then a second meeting that you had with the president on the issue of the appointment of the CEO for Transnet.
Correct.
The first one having been about a month or so after your appointment as Minister of Public Enterprises.
Correct.
So that a month or so would have been early June 2009, is that right? I think you were appointed
Yes.
about 10 May
Yeah.
or 11 May.
June,
Yeah.
yes.
So the first meeting, your first meeting with him in regard to this issue would have been around early June.
I think I
Or
give
towards
the date.
mid-June.
I think I give the yes, it was towards, I say approximately a month after my appointment, so
Yes.
June
So
sometime, yeah.
that would be somewhere in the first half of June.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
To clarify the chair's questions, if you can go to page 9, just to paint in the chronology, paragraph 33, that's where you talk about the first meeting,
Yes.
and you'll see that it's approximately a month after my appointment.
Yeah.
Now, if you may refer back to Annexure D, page 53.
Page
5.3.
5.3, okay. Yes.
You have outlined the topics which are dealt with in this memorandum on paragraph 1.1 to 1.5.
Yes.
And I take it that from, if one peruse this document, one will find these issues being ventilated at great length.
Yes.
And this is what the president had in his position when you were trying to convey to him the importance of appointing Mr. Maseko.
Correct.
Now, just to clear one of the issues where there might be a lacuna in terms of your documents, could you explain to the chair whether at the time when you were preparing your statement, did you have all the necessary documents that you required?
Yes, I did.
You did. Did you receive all the emails that you required from your previous office?
I did, but there was a problem. I wrote an official letter to Minister Gordan requesting access to my documents in order to prepare this statement.
I'm sorry, to Minister?
Gordan, because he's the Minister of Public Enterprises now. So I requested access to documents in order to prepare. They were able to assist me, and he assigned an advocate in his department to assist me, and I signed off, and they signed off that these were copies. But it was evident that my papers had been quite considerably tampered with. And also, we could find no record of my emails. It seemed that they'd been deleted from my time, and maybe a little later, from the server of the Department of Public Enterprises. So I did have to reconstruct, as best as I could, some of these documents and my understanding. I spent a lot of time doing that, just to make sure that that it was solid.
Yes.
Thank you, thank you.
Now, we were still dealing with Annexure D on page 5.3. You have also testified about your second meeting with the ex-president. Now, what I want to know is that after that meeting, or during that meeting, what was the reaction of the president?
Or maybe before that, could you give me the main features of this document that you presented?
The main?
The main features. Yeah,
Okay.
main points.
Okay.
In other words, you don't need to say everything,
Yes.
but what you consider were the main points that the memorandum contained, which obviously you probably mentioned to the former president.
Yeah. The main points was firstly the legal framework regarding the appointment of a group CEO for Transnet that's founded in the Transnet founding documents. And
that briefly was just to...
okay, I'll go through it here. I'm talking to page 55. It says here the Transnet's Articles of Association do provide specifically for the appointment of the board and the CEO. Articles 69 and 71 vest the power to appoint the CEO with the shareholder, the minister, in a general meeting. Article 69 specifically addresses the appointment of executive directors, that is the CEO, the CFO, and any other executive director, while Article 71 deals with the non-executive directors. And so I was giving who has executive authority to appoint. That was one of the matters, because I thought the president did not understand that kind of component or was not agreeing with it. Then I went through the CEO recruitment and selection process, as I've done with you, how thorough, what it was about, what the competencies we needed.
Effectively in the same way you have explained.
Done it with yourself, yes.
That you explained to him as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also dealt with the investigation into the issues of corruption. And I gave him the details of both instances, the 50 like new and the security contract which had been given to Minister Nyanda's company. Let me say, Minister Nyanda was no longer, when he became a cabinet minister, he then moved out of that company, but at the time he had been a member. So I gave the president details of all of that. I also informed him of the legal onus on the board to take action when such instances of misconduct do occur, and that it wasn't the board's decision to make to follow up. It was actually a legal requirement. And so that was followed up with him. And then I repeated my recommendation that he notes the contents of this memorandum and approves the submission of a cabinet memorandum recommending the appointment. Now, I want to be very clear. I wasn't asking the president to approve Mr. Maseko. I was asking him to approve a cabinet memorandum recommending the appointment. Now, as I've said to you before, the cabinet memorandums go through a subcommittee of cabinet and then go to cabinet. When a minister is under pressure, and it's an important issue, the minister can write a letter to the president explaining why the minister would prefer to bypass the subcommittee process because of certain exigencies. And the president is then empowered to grant the minister to place that on the agenda. And that's what I was referring to, because it was already getting very late for the board.
So the approval that you were seeking from the former president was an approval of bypassing the subcommittee of cabinet in regard to this memorandum and going straight to cabinet.
My recommendation says that. Well, not to, it just says approves the submission of a cabinet memorandum. I didn't go into details of which process.
So, but what I mean is the approval you wanted related to the process, to the procedure.
Yes, to procedures.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. It was because Advocate Trengrove had advised very strongly, and others as well, that you should not be asking for approval. You should be consulting with.
I think Mr. Mkwena's question before mine was therefore what the former president's reaction was to your recommendation at that meeting.
Yes.
He said he would come back to me.
Now, may I refer you to Annexure E, page 94?
And maybe before you go there, at your first meeting with the former president on this issue, had you left him with documentation relating to the issue that he could have looked at after your meeting, or not really?
Yes, I left him. The problem with meeting was in virtually every instance of meeting with the president, is that there was never an aide present. My experience with President Motlanthe previously, when I was Minister of Health, is that if there was something very important that you had to discuss, not just something quickly that you put pass by him, you would request that meeting. On occasions, the President's office would contact the DG or someone and say, what is this about? And, there would be various things. But in most instances, in virtually all those instances when he was President, there would be an aide taking a record of that decision. With President Zuma, there wasn't that. You met at his house. It was, the housekeeper sometimes would organize the meetings. There wasn't a professionalism there.
I was referring you to Annex Chai on page 94. Mm-hmm. Now, you had told the chair that when we testified about Annex Chai D, that you had a meeting with the ex-president, Mr. Zuma. You left him with that document. You took him through that document. And he said he will revert to you. Am I correct?
Correct.
Now, can you tell us, identify for us Annex Chai E and tell us what was the purpose of you dispatching this letter to the president?
So, having not heard from the President and knowing that I had to get within the cabinet cycle, I then formally addressed a letter to the President requesting permission for the late and direct submission of the cabinet memorandum, and therefore for the appointment of Mr. Maseko.
Now, in terms of the dates, I know I'll give you the opportunity to proceed with that evidence. We know that Annex D is dated the 28th of July, 2009, Annex D, and Annex E, it's now dated the 25th of August, 2009. Almost a period of a month has lapsed without you hearing from the ex-president.
Yes.
Yes, you can now proceed dealing with Annex E.
Yeah. So I then request the President's permission because I'd not heard, I'd requested that I put it before Cabinet. I had not heard from him. So I did the formal request, which you're supposed to do as a minister. And I think I spoke telephonically. I can't remember. All I have is that this memo was then withdrawn from the Cabinet agenda. And the President then said he wanted several names, not only for the CEO position, but he wanted several names for the chairperson.
Now, do you know who withdrew the memorandum from Cabinet?
This memo, who wrote this?
No, who withdrew the memorandum?
The Cabinet Secretariat were instructed to withdraw the memorandum. And they said the President had given that instruction.
Oh, yes, and you said that the President wanted several names of what?
For the chairperson of the board. I had not requested anything yet to put forward a memorandum on the chairperson, but the President now wanted 3 names for the chairperson of the board.
Would this have been around August now?
28th of August. Yeah, oh, yes. The formal request I put through was on the 28th of August.
And had Mr. Paswana left the Transnet board at that stage?
He had left at the end of July.
Oh, okay, all right. But the point you make is that you had not yet approached the President about the filling of that vacant position.
Yes. I surmise that what I'd said to him, that it was important to have appointments, is that There was now an acting chair, acting CFO, acting group CEO, acting CEO of Freight Rail, and that might have been the context. I can't exactly remember. But he now wanted me to give him 3 names so he could decide.
Now, you dispatch Annexure E to the President. Did he react to this letter?
And, he did in the sense that the memo was withdrawn from Cabinet. It did not serve at Cabinet, the recommendation.
Did you find any opportunity to address the Cabinet on the issue of the issues that you wanted to raise, that you have raised with the President?
I could not raise that issue following on this until Mr. Gama's disciplinary proceedings were completed, and they were only finished in June when he was dismissed from Transnet in June 2010. It was almost a year later. So Transnet was left completely vulnerable with acting positions all the way through.
Now, were you consulted in any way about the withdrawal of the memorandum from Cabinet?
No. The President, what I surmise is that the President said, this is not going through. I want now you to add 3 more names for chairpersons, for chairperson.
But as at the date when that happened, he had not come back to you on the documentation you had submitted to him in July.
No, he had not.
Thank you.
Now, on paragraph 44, page 12.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mokoena. The 3 names that the former president was asking for, were those exclusively for the position of chairperson of the board, Transit Board, or did he also mean he wanted other names for the position of CEO as well?
No, he was then talking about the chairperson of the board.
As at that time, what was your understanding of the president's position on the issue of CEO, Group CEO for Transnet? Was it that he wanted the search for a CEO to be put in abeyance until the disciplinary process relating to Mr. Gama was finished, at which stage then all relevant candidates could be considered and a choice be made? Or were your understanding that whatever happened, Mr. Gama was the one to be appointed at the end of that process if he was not dismissed as a result of the process? What was your understanding?
That Mr. Gama must be appointed.
And your understanding that that was his position, did it ever change at any stage while you were Minister of Public Enterprises?
No.
It didn't. Was there any time when you did ask whether the former president had any problem with the candidate recommended by the board In other words, did you get a chance to say, Mr. President, do you have any particular problem with this candidate who has been recommended by the board? And maybe if you did, what was the answer?
The answer was that Mr. Gama is being persecuted.
So you did get a chance to
Oh, yes,
to
when
ask
I
that,
briefed
yeah.
him the first time and the second
Yes,
time.
yes.
But he was not prepared to discuss the merits of Mr. Maseko.
Yes.
He simply wanted Mr. Gama appointed.
So he didn't articulate any criticism of Mr. Masego's capabilities or experience or knowledge?
No.
Okay.
And Mr. Maseko then withdrew as a candidate in September.
Yes,
thank you.
Ms. Hogan, just for completeness so that we don't leave the chair behind, may I refer to page 10, paragraph 34. And in that paragraph, you address the questions that were now put by the chair in order to clarify your evidence. You answer as follows. You are saying in a statement, I was shocked and disappointed when President Zuma informed me that he was adamant that Mr. Gama was his only choice for the group CEO. I informed him that that was not possible and that Mr. Gama was not the board's choice, and I could not override the board as they had undergone a very professional selection process. I further informed President Zuma that Mr. Gama was the subject of an inquiry into procurement irregularities, and it would be very messy to appoint a group CEO who could potentially be facing fairly serious charges. And fundamentally, you say, President Zuma said that if that was my view, no appointment whatsoever was to be made at Transnet until Mr. Gama's disciplinary process was over. We agreed that I would provide him with more detailed information for him to further apply his mind. So there was no doubt in the ex-president's mind as to whom he wanted as the group CEO.
Yes.
Despite everything else that you have conveyed to him.
Yes.
Was there an appreciation on your part that if you were the appointing authority in respect of the CEO and there were a number of candidates and the board had recommended a certain candidate, that if you appointed another candidate, you would, as a matter of law, be required to be able to justify why you chose a particular candidate and not another candidate? You had that appreciation.
Exactly.
Yes, and that you would need to be able to defend your decision.
Yes, I was aware of that. And for me, it was really important that a board has confidence in a CEO, otherwise it's just not going to work. And yes, it was not for me now to go looking around for another candidate who they had said they would prefer not to appoint at that point in time. Sorry, yeah.
No. Continue.
No, that's...
From what you say, it seems that you were not given anything, even if you may have been open to appointing somebody else other than Mr. Masego. You were not given any grounds as to why Mr. Gama was or would have been a better candidate than Mr. Masego.
I was given no grounds, and what I learned from this experience and from what the president had said is that I would not be able to put before Cabinet any proposal relating to Transnet going forward, apart from submitting a very dubious memorandum nominating 3 names for Cabinet or the President to decide, which I was advised was usurping an executive authority. And I, quite frankly, had started to become alarmed at, and I didn't understand it, what the underlying motives must be for all of us. What was the interest in just one particular candidate? And what was the interest in a chair then that seemed to go beyond just the interests of Transnet as a company?
Did you get to know whether the former president also had an appreciation that whoever was chosen as the CEO, that decision would need to be a decision that could be justifiable in terms of why choose this one and not that one? Did you?
In the days following his suspension, Minister Jeff Radebe, Gama, in quotes, Gama will become CEO. Minister Spiwe Nyanda, in quotes, Gama is being persecuted like Jacob Zuma. And also ANC, the SACP, the South African Transport Union, and ANC Youth League, under Julius Malema at the time, all issued strong and harsh statements in support of Gama, accusing Transnet of persecuting him. This was reflected in numerous statements and reports in the media, which I attach here to marked F1 to F13. I need to explore with you some of those media reports in order for us to be able to appreciate the influence and the pressure which you say was exerted upon you at the time in relation to this issue. May I then